let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Welcome. Our guest today is Dr. Wendell Mauter. He is Professor Emeritus of History at Quincy University. He has history degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a PhD from Marquette University. He has written extensively on European history, including on Anglo-American relations in the 1950s, Chamberlain's struggle for peace in 1939, Britain's foreign policy towards Germany, 1933 to 1937, among other topics. He has taught and lectured on several subjects, including our topic of discussion today, the collapse of democracy in the German Weimar Republic, the rise of Adolf Hitler, and setting the stage for World War II. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, Dr. Mauter. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I've taught courses on Nazi Germany and Hitler, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust and World War II for many years. So now that I've retired, I want to keep doing it. I love it. I love that topic.
I for some reason, I'd always been involved in American history. I was one of your students a long time ago, but I was focused mainly on American history, even though our degrees had to be balanced. Mm-hmm. So we did take some European history. And then I got into Lincoln history and researching Lincoln. And when I was deployed just recently, I'm like, I need to get more information on World War II. Being a soldier, I felt like I didn't know enough. And so just recently, not that I hadn't studied it before, but more in depth. And then that discussion about, to me, it's like a quintessential question. How does it happen? How does something like that happen in a society, a German society, which is cultured and educated and industrial? It just amazes me. It's just a fascinating topic. So that'll be we'll work through it today and see if we can answer some of those questions for other people, because I was misinformed about some things, even as a history student. And as I studied it, I found out I didn't know enough about Adolf Hitler personally. I had a total misconception about his work habits and things like that, and then how he ruled when he was Fuhrer. I was completely wrong about those things, and so maybe we can talk about some of those things today.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Dr. Mauter, it's tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special beverage. Today, we have a Hefeweizen from Hofbrau Brewery in Germany. Now, they profess to be the original brew of Bavarian kings, and according to legend, Wilhelm V, the Duke of Bavaria, he was unhappy with the quality of imported beers into Munich at that time, so he commissioned the construction of the Hofbrau House, and I may not be pronouncing, my German may not be that good.
That's great. I've been there.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So he hired a brewmaster from a German monastery, and they have been brewing beer in accordance with Bavarian German purity laws since that time, including the Hefeweizen that we will feature today. If listeners would like to join us, the selection today for the Hofbrau München Brewery is available at the Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. And remember, you can suggest a feature beer for future episodes. Just subscribe, leave your suggestion in the comments. If your beer is selected, you will receive a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee, so you can try some of the beverages we feature on the program. So please subscribe and leave a comment. So Dr. Mauter, if you would just, in the beginning, could you set the stage for us in Germany after World War I, the problems, at least for the Germans, with the Treaty of Versailles, and why is it so hard for men like Hitler to accept the provisions of that peace and the German surrender?
Well, it wasn't just Hitler. I think the best way to describe Germany after World War I was it was a broken, traumatic country. They fought 4 years. They had sacrificed immensely, not just in terms of men dying and wounded, permanently wounded. I remember when I was over there in the 70s, when I was in the service, you'd still see old men walking around, without an arm or a leg in the sort of town square, from World War I. So you had a whole generation of sort of lost generation people, the humiliation of sacrificing economically. The people in Germany at the end of World War I, some of them were starving to death. It was really bad economic times. And then the humiliation of losing the war. I think it was a very broken country after the war. And, of course, signing the armistice, which the new government, because the Kaiser was sort of kicked out on the 9th of November, then a couple of days later we have the new government coming in, a socialist government, a Social Democratic Party government. And they had no other choice but to sign this humiliating treaty, or at least armistice ending the war. And then once the Allies got together and came up with a peace treaty, again, this new democracy had no other choice but to sign it, because if they hadn't signed it, the Allies had maintained economic blockade. And I don't know, not many people know this, but more Germans died as a result of the blockade after the war ended up until the treaty was signed than had died during the war of starvation and malnutrition.
That's amazing.
Yeah, because the Allies knew if they didn't keep the pressure on, Germany was not going to sign this tough treaty. And so they really had no choice but to sign it. And if they hadn't signed it, the Allied armies would have they were already in the Rhine, they just would have moved further inland, and there was nothing the Germans could do militarily to stop them. They had essentially disarmed in the armistice terms. So Germany was a very broken country, and I think that's the only way for somebody like Hitler to ever have come to power in Germany. Because for a person like him in World War I, it would have been laughed at. He was a joke, somebody like him, a marginal person on the edge of society. He had no future. So the country had to be completely broken for somebody like Hitler or the Nazis to come to power.
So sometimes I think there's a misconception. It was mine that the Nazis were the ones who drove through by sheer will or what have you and achieved power, but they were not alone in the philosophical right in Germany at that time. What were some of the other groups, and where did the National Socialism fit within those groups on the right in Germany in the 20s and, say, early 30s?
Yeah, there were a lot of right-wing sort of conservative nationalist, or even further to the right than that, after World War I. The number of anti-Semitic right parties in 1920s just exploded because of all the chaos during the 1920s, particularly the early 20s. So Hitler and the Nazis were not the only ones. There were plenty of others with them. The others stayed rather small mostly, and it's the Hitler and the Nazis that eventually got larger. But in the early 1920s, there were a lot of sort of anti-democratic, anti-socialist right-wing groups.
So the Nazis coalesced some of those smaller groups under their umbrella eventually? Eventually,
yeah. Particularly by the early 1930s, a lot of those people were sort of migrating toward the Nazis. And of course, the Weimar Republic had a very difficult life. It was blamed for signing the armistice. It was blamed for this totally, in their view, unfair Versailles Treaty. Massive inflation came in the early 1920s when the French and the Belgians invaded the Ruhr area because the Germans couldn't or didn't pay their reparations from the Versailles Treaty. And so they occupied really the industrial heart of Germany. And the Weimar democracy couldn't do anything to get them out, so they paid the workers not to go to work for the French and the Belgians. And they had no money, essentially, so they just printed it. And, of course, that caused a massive inflation in the mid to late 1923. I think it was 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. I mean, that is just unbelievable inflation. I know America I don't know if you remember the late 70s. That was we complained about inflation at 20% or 15, 20%. I mean, that was nothing compared to what those people went through. The old image of people with wheelbarrows full of money, that was actually true. Not only do we have pictures of it, but when I grew up, my neighbor was from Munich and came over in the late 20s, and he told me he had wheelbarrows he was pulling with marks. They just were worth nothing.
I remember pictures of children playing with blocks of money as if they were building blocks, like Lincoln logs or something like that.
Yeah, they used them for toilet paper. They used them for blowing their nose. I mean, they were just totally worthless. People got paid 4, 5, 6 times a day because if you waited another hour, the money would be so much worthless. Mm. So it was a very difficult time in those early 1920s for the Weimar Republic to sort of reestablish itself, or establish itself, I should say, and gain some legitimacy, particularly when it was blamed for signing the armistice, for signing the Versailles Treaty, for going through all these economic bad times, which wiped out people's savings. I mean, think of a middle-class person who had saved for 30 years and thought they had money in the bank to retire, and now they're 20,000 marks. It couldn't even buy them a piece of bubble gum. Hmm. Who are they going to blame? They'll blame the government in power, which was the Weimar democracy.
So one of the other misconceptions that I've had over time is Hitler himself. Because he rose to power and he had certain attributes, especially as an orator, I felt like maybe he just did it out of sheer will and dynamism and so forth. But when I studied him, that wasn't the case at all. He wasn't particularly ideological outside of a few key points that he continually pushed. He didn't have a strong work ethic. He didn't have strong social skills. In fact, he was pretty backward in most environments. He didn't have very many friends. Some people say he never really had any friends at all, ever in his life. And it just struck me as interesting how someone with those lack of skills could gain some political traction. Am I accurate in saying in that interpretation of him?
Well, some of Hitler's biographers have talked about that in a sense, the times allowed somebody like Hitler to come to power. That he didn't have that kind of charisma, at least initially in his early days, that he was a sort of a marginal man all the way until the early 1920s when he finally found a purpose in his life. I mean, he never had a paying job. He never did anything.
Sold paintings or something like that. That was the nature of how he raised a little bit of money.
When he was a young man living in Vienna after his mom died, and he tried to get into art school, he failed. Tried to get into architecture school, and he hadn't finished high school. He was a high school dropout, so they wouldn't let him in without a high school diploma, so he failed in that. And even for a time in Vienna, he was even homeless. I'm not sure how long, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month. But a buddy he had run into actually told him, there's a men's hostel in Vienna that you can go in, and it doesn't cost very much. What they did was they let you stay overnight in a room, but in the daytime you had to leave. But you still had to come up with a few marks to be able to, or shillings in Austria to be able to do that. And so what his friend said, I know you like to draw. How about drawing these famous buildings and stuff like that? And what they were for wasn't, people didn't buy them for the art. They bought him for the frame. So something, when you go to the store, they have a little picture of like Brad Pitt or something. You're not buying the picture of Brad Pitt. You're buying the nice little silver frame. So that's how he made a living, sort of eking out an existence like that in his younger years. And it was really only in World War I that he finally found something that gave him a sense of purpose, and that was fighting for Germany in World War I. And there's a little bit of an argument these days about how good a soldier he was, but he did win 2 Iron Crosses and was wounded twice. But interestingly enough, he never got promoted. I mean, they had lost so many officers in World War I that they were promoting enlisted men to officers, a fair amount. He never even became an NCO.
I wonder if his social skills
Yes.
got in the way of that.
Absolutely.
And so he did, as far as I knew, distinguish himself so forth as a courier. And that was very dangerous at that time. And he was somewhat accomplished at that. But you're right, he didn't rise in military rank at all. It may be due to you have to build, even in that environment,
Yes.
you have to build friendships and social relationships. And he just simply could not do that very well.
In fact, his officers, who would have been the ones putting him up for a promotion, said he just had no empathy for others. I mean, an officer has to have a certain, I mean, he's got to order men to do things, including go into combat and perhaps die, but you have to have a sense of empathy for the men who are under your command. He never did. And that's really, he really never had any really good friendships, because friendships require a sense of mutuality, that you respect somebody in their own right. He never did. He just didn't. So it's interesting, a man who's going to become leader of one of the most powerful countries in the world by the mid-20th century didn't seem to have any leadership skills in World War I.
That's what I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
I couldn't discern any noticeable leadership skills.
Yeah.
And being an officer in the Army, I'm a field grade officer, I didn't see anything that would indicate that he could rise to power or prominence. But it's not always about that. And he's in a political environment that it kind of lends itself to the skills that he does have. I know initially he would go into the beer halls and so forth, and he didn't consider himself like the messiah of their movement. He thought he was going to be, he knew he could speak well, and they would put him up for that purpose, but others were coming up with the ideology. He was just professing it. So when he gets into the beer halls initially, and is it his speaking that gets him notoriety initially? Is that what it is?
Well, he probably became politicized right after World War I, because once Germany had lost the war, Hitler was so unambitious, he couldn't think of what else to do. He, like I said, never had a paying job before. So essentially just stayed in the army, right? 3 hots and a cot. I mean, that was something anyway. And he probably became politicized when the army made him a political officer. So after World War I, the new German army, the Reichswehr, wanted to keep an eye on different political groups. And so they had indoctrination sessions, sometimes with political, like history teachers or geography teachers, from the universities. And they gave these sessions to sort of teach the political officers different ideologies and how to think about issues and what they were supposed to do when they observed these political parties that were popping up all over Germany after World War I. So that's probably where Hitler became sort of politicized, because one of his sort of mentors there, who was a professor, was Gottfried Frieder. And Frieder was the one who was a real sort of right-wing nationalist that really sort of got a lot of these things going for Hitler. But you're right. Hitler had almost no new ideas. They're all ideas that existed out there, some of them dating back to the 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century. So he's not a man who comes up with new ideas, but he can package them and he can sell them with the force of his sort of will and his ability to communicate through speeches. Those long harangues that he used to give, riling up the audience, that's what he was good at. That was his forte, I guess.
So the Nazis and National Socialism is fledgling in the beginning. And then there is an attempted coup, which is the beer hall putsch, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it fails, but through the midst of that, and then his arrest, Adolf Hitler's arrest and trial, and then imprisonment, from that point on, it was the best thing that could happen to him politically. Could you explain that a little bit? Maybe a little bit about the attempted coup, and then how it morphs him into a figure within National Socialism that he really wasn't before that.
Yeah, you have to remember what we talked about before with the massive hyperinflation that was going on. a lot of discontent in society in 1923. And this was the time that Hitler thought was ripe to do a march first on Munich, and then hopefully they would end up going to Berlin and getting rid of the socialist government, the SPD government that was in there. And so it's the discontent in this time period that allows him to pull this coup off, along with Ludendorff, one of the great German generals from World War I, number two to Hindenburg in World War I. And other right-wing parties were associated with this too. It was this opportunity for Hitler to seize power in this way. In other words, Hitler first becomes a revolutionary in the early 20s, and this is taking over by force, And once he gets arrested for treason, that's what it is, and then he goes to trial. And there's a couple of interesting things in the trial. There's a couple of great books, one by, I think it was Peter King's out there, and I can't remember the name of the other author, but some really good books that have just come out, finding new information on this event that's almost 90-some years old, the trial, that when Hitler was put on trial, he was tried in a special people's court in Bavaria, where it happened, and not in a Reich court in Leipzig. And so it was a different type of justice. It was a local justice rather than sort of a national court, like we would call them a federal court, I suppose. And he was, his judge was selected, a very sympathetic, sort of right-wing nationalist judge who had been there from the days of the Second Reich under the Kaiser, so he was not a friend of democracy. And so he had, in a sense, a good judge. It was an easy court, and the court allowed him, this judge allowed him to use it as a platform because the media was there, not just German media, but American media, the British media was there, French media. So he had a national and an international platform to spew out his ideological views on everything, to rant against the government in power, the socialist government that was in power in Weimar Germany. And this gave him a really massive platform to sort of gain national recognition. He wasn't just a Bavarian politician, but a national one now. And of course, he does get convicted because he admits he did it. I mean, the evidence is there. But the sentence he gets is 5 years in what we would call a country club prison.
Well, he's allowed to write. He writes Mein Kampf. I think Rudolf Hess is with him at the time, so he's not even isolated.
He if you see pictures of him in the Landsberg jail, he's wearing civilian clothes. There's no prison outfit. People are allowed to bring him food and beer. He actually gains weight because, he's not doing anything physical there in jail. His door is open. People come in and out all the time. I really was we would call it a country club jail there. And so it's while he was in this prison then that he has the time to come up and sort of think about, well, what do I actually believe in? And that's when he begins to write the Mein Kampf there.
And I think he only serves about a year.
Less than that, 9 months. He actually was in prison at Landsberg for 9 months, and then he's paroled in December of 1924. What's interesting, though, is when he was paroled, he should have, according to the law, he should have been deported as a felon because he was not a German citizen at this time. He was an Austrian citizen because he was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so he should have been deported, but he wasn't. That could have certainly changed history. We talk about how the judge was so sympathetic. The judge even was quoted as saying during the trial, "What a fine fellow this chap Hitler is." So,
there's a quote from Ian Kershaw's book that seemed interesting to me. Kershaw says, quote, "Crisis was Hitler's oxygen. He needed it to survive," end quote. To me, that's the way the Nazis gained powers. They needed crisis because as you look at the 1920s, after World War I, it was difficult in Germany, but it started to improve a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they kept indicating these dire warnings about what was happening, but the economic condition was actually improving. It was only after, in 1929, and then the stock market crash in the United States, which created a worldwide depression, that the Nazis then gained traction again. So in that quote, is that about right, that he needs that crisis, him personally, I guess, to get him fired up about a particular cause, and then that's what the Nazis needed to survive?
Absolutely. I think if you look at demagogic politicians, which clearly Hitler was, all demagogic politicians need chaos and they need crisis, because that gives them opportunities to exploit. And when people are in crisis, they're angry, they're upset, sometimes they're unsettled, and this allows opportunities to manipulate them, and that's exactly what he did. If you take a look at the Nazi vote, because in 1928, in the good times, in the later years of the Weimar Republic, the Nazi in the national election, Reichstag election, had something like 2.6%. In September of 1930, so we're into the Depression almost a year, and so unemployment has gone way up, the Nazis go to like 18.7. They become the second largest party in the Reichstag in Germany. So clearly, a lot of that vote is protest vote. It's people who are upset. You know, they're not committed Nazis. They're people who just want to blame somebody, and the Nazis are the ones blaming the people in power. They're the most vehement in putting the blame on others.
You know, the other thing that was my misconception about Hitler was I always felt he was an ideologue, that it was entrenched in his bones. And then when I got into the research, that wasn't the case at all. I mean, he had certain concepts that he used. I have another quote from Kershaw, if I could use it. He said, quote, "Within the framework of his basic worldview, Hitler himself was flexible, even indifferent towards ideological issues, which could obsess his followers. Opponents at the time and many later commentators frequently underestimated the dynamism of Nazi ideology because of its diffuseness and because of cynicism of Nazi propaganda. Ideology was often regarded as no more than a cloak for power ambitions and tyranny," close quote. That was I didn't understand that when I was younger. I thought he was the ideological pole star, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
You know, in the early 1920s, I think it was 1921, the Nazis came up with a 25-point program. Okay, you think, well, that's just very specific points, and that's an ideological point of view. But that's not the case, because what Hitler wanted above all is to have the power to do anything he wanted at any time, even within the Nazi Party. So he didn't want people arguing like on the left. You know, the communists are always arguing, well, what did Marx mean? Or what did Lenin mean when he wrote this? They're always fighting about all these little things. And of course, you know, we know that there's splinter communist parties all over the place and socialist parties and things like that. But Hitler did not want that. He wanted people to unite around him, and whatever he said would be the policy. And so that's why when he came into power, he essentially froze the 25-point program, even though he never followed almost any of it, or a lot of it wasn't followed at all, because he didn't want people arguing about ideology. He wanted people united around him as the source of all truth. So that in that way, he wasn't an ideologue, though I think he sincerely believed in some of the social Darwinist ideas about races and better races and inferior races, and the superior races should take over the inferior races. I think there was a couple key ideological points that he had absorbed, maybe growing up, or and reading a few of these people, so these philosophers.
Maybe in the army, and when he gets exposed to other people more, as you mentioned, in his political position, and then he's actually employed to go into these beer halls, and he's hearing a lot of that ideology, probably absorbed quite a bit of it.
Yeah, he didn't read a lot of the philosophers' books themselves, but he wrote sort of bastardized versions in pamphlets that would come out all the time in Vienna and in Germany. So that's why he sort of picked up little bits and pieces of some of these things. But yeah, I think Kershaw also makes the point that Hitler was a supreme opportunist. He always saw opportunities here. And even though he knew the direction he was going, he wasn't rigid. I mean, in other words, Mein Kampf is not a blueprint for power. It's not step one, we do this, step two, we do this. That's what people used to think sometimes, but it's not. It's a direction, and he's completely opportunistic about when he would go in that direction. If an opportunity came up, he'd go in this direction a little bit. He zigged this way or zagged that way. Eventually, he's going to get to where he wants to go, that big goal. But any step in the meantime is going to depend on opportunities he can exploit.
And in that coup, what was interesting to me, the rest of them scatter. So Ernst Röhm leaves, Goring leaves. These are military heroes, and they're scattering, and he's staying put. And that was another thing that was interesting to me. How, why were they scattering and he stayed put, and they were supposed to be the ones that had bravery and so forth, and he was supposed to be lacking in some things.
Well, you're talking about the Munich Putsch.
Right. I know, kind of going back a little bit, but in your discussion, you were talking, it just made me think that some of these other individuals who should have been prominent Germans, maybe Goring should have been the leader of the Nazi Party, but he's absent in some of the most critical points, especially in that time period. Hitler is never absent.
Well, in the event itself, in the Putsch event, when they were marching through and somebody shot, nobody still knows who shot, but eventually a shot rang out and the Munich police fired, and the person next to Hitler, I think, was shot, and so one of Hitler's companions pulled him down, and he dislocated his shoulder there. And so in the chaos that followed, he went off and was staying at the house of Pucci Hofschnagel, who was one of his funders. Pucci actually went to school in America, knew English very well and had good connections. But actually he was staying at her house when the police arrived to pick him up and arrest him. So I'm not sure he had a really good opportunity to escape, because Goering was actually a fairly wealthy man. He had married a wealthy Swedish woman, so he had connections. He could get out. And Ludendorff didn't leave either. Ludendorff was also on trial in 1924, along with Hitler, as the Treason Trial there.
So if we move forward and we briefly discuss the stock market crash and then the deterioration of the German economy, could you describe how the Nazis go from that 2% to that larger percentage of the population? You said it was a protest vote. And then what are how does Hitler position himself during that time? So, from the point where, there's, he's imprisoned, and then over the course of time, he's still indicating these criticisms against the Weimar Republic. Then the stock market crash happens, and now all of a sudden it's almost like he's skyrocketing into a position of power. Could you describe that a little bit?
Well, one of the things that Hitler did when he came out of prison is to realize that, particularly when Germany was recovering, the Weimar democracy was recovering economically, financially in the late 1920s, that being a revolutionary wasn't going to work. So he decides to become a politician to get into power, which means you have to win elections. And so he reorganizes the Nazi Party when he comes out under a couple principles. Certainly one is to build a mass-based party and run for election. And the second principle is the Führer principle. In other words, he wants to build a party that is completely loyal to him, not to an ideology, as we talked about before, but to him personally. And I guess the third thing he did with that party, once he started building the mass-based party that would actually compete in elections, he started creating a whole bunch of different organizations within the Nazi Party for people to join. So we have regular Nazi Party, we have the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the sort of a paramilitary thugs. We begin to have the SS becomes a little more prominent. He was a protection squad for him. But he creates, this is when the Hitler Youth Organization and all sorts of organizations, they had motor clubs, Nazi flying clubs, Nazi soccer clubs, I guess we call them football, Nazi bowling clubs. I mean, all kinds of organizations, Nazi gymnasts. So he had all organizations for women. So he had all these different organizations for when the party got stronger and bigger, people could be recruited into all these different organizations. So he sort of had a plan to sort of allow the organization to expand itself if it ever became popular.
Well, that in itself is political skill.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And propaganda. Putting Goebbels in charge of party propaganda was sort of an evil genius move, I guess you might say, because Goebbels was a genius at propaganda. I mean, we're still trying to figure out all the techniques that Goebbels used 80, 90 years ago. They were so far ahead of its time in terms of political manipulation. So then the emphasis became how to create propaganda to bring people in, to create an image of the party as strong and decisive, the image of a movement that was going to be successful and take over. And who doesn't want to join a successful movement, right? Particularly when times get bad, as they will when the Depression hits. And so when Hitler comes out of prison and starts reorganizing the party, it's still pretty small. By 1929, it has 178,000 members. The Communist Party has 114,000. So they're already bigger in terms of membership than the Communist Party, which had been in operation for almost a decade before that. So Hitler's sort of building the foundations, you might say. He's learning how to run elections. He's learning how to do propaganda. He's got everything set. And what gave him the opportunity was, I think, the Great Depression, because that gave him a large number of people maybe willing to listen why things aren't going well and what can we do to change that.
So you mentioned some of those groups, and that was another thing I didn't quite understand. You'd hear the SA or the SS or the Einsatzgruppen, and I would get all confused on what those were until I started looking at it. If I throw out some of these different groups, could you give me about 30 seconds on each one?
Sure. Just
to put things into perspective so when individuals hear those names, they'll know exactly what that group was. So let's start with the SA.
Okay, that's the sort of Nazi paramilitary group. And mostly he used them not to challenge the army. I mean, not in terms of,
like street thugs.
Yeah, exactly. Because street thugs were useful initially to defend these beer hall meetings because, the communists or the socialists would try to disrupt the meetings, so they would have big fights to keep them out. But what they tended to do to get publicity and to get sort of a sense of movement is for the SA to go out and march in different parts of the cities where the communist neighborhood or socialist neighborhood or something like that. And of course, marching into those neighborhoods would cause the communists to come out, and there'd be these big fights. And so there's a lot of publicity, and you have all these guys in uniform, and it gives a sense of strength and movement and purpose. And so he used them to create often the violence and the chaos that he could use to exploit politically. So that's really what the SA was used for mostly.
And eventually it becomes almost a problem for him.
It becomes a big problem for him after he comes into power, after he becomes a dictator, after Germany becomes a one-party state. The only group that's big enough to threaten him is within his own movement, the Nazi movement, because by the summer of 1934, the SA had 3.5 to 4 million members. Well, they're in power now. He doesn't want them to cause chaos. I mean, these guys love to go out and drink and have get drunk and go beat up somebody. But since he's the government now, that's bad for him. And these people had wanted to take power and get the benefits from power. They wanted to get the rewards. That's why Ernst Rohm, who was the leader of the SA at that point, he was making speeches. We've had a nationalist revolution. now we must have a Nazi revolution, a National Socialist revolution. But Hitler was done with revolutions because a revolution was to get him in power. He's in power. He doesn't want any challenges. So once Germany becomes a one-party state, the only threat to him is from within. And that's why he ended up crushing the SA in the Night of the Long Knives at the end of June 1934.
So we'll get to the Night of the Long Knives here in a minute, but just to keep our the discussion going in line with what we were talking about, how about the SS? 30 seconds or a minute on who the SS is.
Yeah, SS starts out as a personal protection squad for Hitler himself, personally. Very small initially, a couple hundred guys in most of the 1920s. It's really in the early 30s that the SS starts getting bigger when Himmler takes over. I think he takes over in 1929, late 29. And Himmler was an extremely ambitious person, a true believer in Nazism, but also an empire builder. So he wanted to use the SS to sort of gain more power within the Nazi movement. And of course, one of the people who was his rivals was Ernst Röhm in the SS. So he was always looking for a way to get Ernst Röhm down and to challenge the SS. So he was one of the people in 1934 that was telling Hitler, you got to crush the SA. You got to crush them. And once the SA were crushed, then that allowed Himmler and the SS to get more and more powerful. Larger, recruit more people, begin to get involved in policing, things like that. And eventually some military units, the Waffen-SS, were formed in the 30s, and they expand tremendously in World War II.
How about the SD?
Now, the SD was part of the SS. They were Sicherheitsdienst, so they were sort of the intelligence unit that was headed by Reinhard Heydrich, who becomes a big figure in the Holocaust, helping sort of organize the Holocaust.
He seems to be the quintessential Nazi.
Absolutely.
When you hear...
Blonde, blue-eyed, tall.
Military experience.
Absolutely. He was in the Navy until he was ousted from the Navy, kicked out of the Navy. Very sort of cold, ruthless. Of course, Himmler was pretty ruthless himself. But he was a perfect sort of number two to Himmler in the SS.
How about the Gestapo?
Actually, the Gestapo actually predates Hitler coming to power. Germany is divided into different sort of states. They call them Länder. We would call them states, like Michigan and whatever, in Illinois. The Prussian state in Germany was actually huge. Actually, 2/3 of all Germany was in one state. And they had actually created a political police in the Weimar time before Hitler comes into power. But when Hitler comes into power and Goering is the Minister of Interior in Prussia, he begins to turn this political police into what we know as the Gestapo. So these were completely, utterly ruthless people who would literally do anything that they were asked to do, torture, murder, and they were feared for the rest of the existence of Nazi Germany.
So that those dynamics between those leading Nazis, the constant competition with one another, which leads, among other things, to the Night of the Long Knives. You referenced that, but could you explain what happened in the Night of the Long Knives?
Yeah, Hitler was, like I said, was facing a problem by 1934. The momentum of the movement had got Hitler into power. By 1934, he did his Gleichschaltung, his coordination of power. He was firmly in power. Enthusiasm began to wane. It's hard to keep people up at that pitch of enthusiasm forever, even members of the party. And so as the party starts to sort of wobble a little bit, maybe disintegrate a little bit because of all this competition, we get opposition by some members in Germany, even his vice chancellor, a man by the name of Fritz von Papen. So von Papen, member of the old conservative national elite, because remember, when Hitler comes into power initially, it's in a sort of a coalition government. And so he's allied. It's the conservative nationalist elites who helped Hitler get into power in the first place, because Hitler was never voted into power. I want to make sure people understand it. Never won a majority in a free and fair election in Germany.
Yeah, I think people have a misconception because there were elections that the Nazis were voted in, but Hitler himself was not voted in.
The Nazis never won. Even in the election in the 5th of March, 1933, after Hitler's appointed chancellor, in this deal he cuts with the conservative nationalist at the end of January 1933. And as soon as Hitler comes into power, he asks for an election. And so Hitler uses all the powers of being the chancellor, the prime minister. And it's not even a completely free and fair election because there's a state monopoly on the radio. That's very important. That's the media, a big media in those days. And he uses the police and he deputizes the SA and the SS to go out there and intimidate and beat up his political opponents, even arrest them. So even this is not a completely free and fair. Even then, in the election of 5th of March 1933, the Nazis only win 43.9% of the vote. So Nazis never won in anything remotely a free and fair election a majority of the German vote.
So going back to the Night of the Long Knives, what's the culmination of that?
Okay. So it comes about because I mentioned von Papen, his vice chancellor. Some of the conservative elites become disenchanted with the Nazis. And their only sort of means they can use to go against Hitler is get to President Hindenburg. He was, the great German general in World War I, but was elected president in 1925, then reelected in 32. Hitler ran against him in 32 and lost. But anyway, so if they can get to Hindenburg and convince him that the SA are causing so much trouble and violence, so much chaos, that what the president should do is disband the government, go to martial law, and let the army rule. Well, that's political death for Hitler. He and the Nazis would be out. And so von Papen, who had a very close relationship with Hindenburg, if he could convince Hindenburg to do this, this would be death for Hitler. So this is one of the things that forced Hitler to act against the SA. Lance the boil, get rid of the problem, crush them, the violence, this chaotic SA violence, bully thug boys, they would be over, they would not be a problem here. And so that, along with Goering and Himmler telling Hitler, you need to do something, is what finally got Hitler to act. Because President Hindenburg actually sent Hitler a letter saying, you need to act or I will. And for Hitler, that was martial law, army taken over, I'm out.
And Ernst Röhm actually is killed during the Night of the Long Knives.
Yeah. All of these were completely illegal murders. Not just SA top leaders like Rohm and other SA leaders were killed. Hitler has a list of people he's hated for years, all the way back to the Munich Putsch. He goes after Gustav Kahr, who was the prime minister of Bavaria when he was arrested back then. He goes after other political generals that he thought sort of squashed his career, and they get killed. Their wives are in the same room. They get killed. These are all illegal murders. And what he does a few days later is come up with a law that retroactively makes these illegal murders legal.
So another thing that I would get confused about initially, especially when I was younger, is all the individuals. And I didn't know how they fit within the Nazi Party. So could we take 30 seconds to a minute on a few of these individuals and maybe just give an overview of each person? So one of the individuals, which you mentioned already, was Joseph Goebbels. So could you, 30 seconds a minute on Joseph Goebbels?
Yeah, in some ways, even though Goebbels sort of lost out in Hitler's favor eventually by the later 1930s and into the war, you have to give Goebbels credit because he understood propaganda better than Hitler. Even though Hitler understood propaganda was very important, and he thought Germany didn't do a good job in World War I, that's why they lost the war. Goebbels understood propaganda in a way that was more sophisticated than Hitler. He knew that if you can get, in movies, for example, Goebbels loved movies, if you can get a bunch of nice, good-looking women dancers with their skirts flying around, if you slipped a little Nazi message in there, it'd be more effective than a blatant propaganda. Hitler was for blatant propaganda movies. He loved movies where the message just hit you over the head. So Goebbels was key to making a more sophisticated sort of propaganda message. And the two messages that he sort of conveyed in the 1930s by controlling everything in the media, films, museums, newspapers, everything was controlled by the Nazis, by Goebbels, was the Hitler myth, that Hitler is sort of some godlike figure, and the Volksgemeinschaft, that we're all in this people's community. Because before Germany, before the Nazis came to power, Germany was very riven by class differences, regional differences, religious differences, occupational differences. I mean, they were very riven and polarized society. But the Nazis portrayed themselves as a group above all that creates a sense of national unity. So those two messages is and the way he conveyed them in a sophisticated manner was sort of Goebbels' genius. So evil though it be.
Right. So we mentioned Ernst Röhm, so I think we covered him pretty well. He was the leader of the SA, the brown shirts. How about Herman Goring? We mentioned him, but he was a very prominent Nazi, and we just kind of mentioned him in passing. So how about 30 seconds or a minute on Goring?
Goring led the famous German squadron, von Richthofen squadron. After von Richthofen in World War I, flying ace, had been killed, he led that famous squadron. So Goering was a World War I flying hero.
In fact, I believe he had the Blue Max.
Yes.
Which was their highest honor, which would have been similar to our Medal of Honor.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he's, had a good pedigree, you might say. Married into money, the Swedish millionaire's daughter. His father had been a governor of Southwest African colonial province. So, he had good credentials, a good education. And for some reason, he latched on to Hitler in the early 1920s and became, in a sense, Hitler's number two. Probably because he had a lot of good contacts, with the wealthy people, with monies, with businessmen, international contacts. So he was very useful to Hitler. Often Hitler sometimes would play, in diplomacy, he'd play the good cop, bad cop. Goering would sometimes go to foreigners and say, well, I'll talk to him. I'm more reasonable than him. And then Hitler would come out with his, ranting and raving and stuff like that. So in many ways, he was very important to Hitler. He helped rebuild the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, after World War I because of his prior experience. And so that was important to Hitler as well, to get the German military back on track, because Hitler eventually knew he was going to start a war. So in many ways, Goering was useful for Hitler, but Goebbels was a very odd man, a drug addict, hugely overweight at times, extremely intelligent, very high IQ, but very strange, narcissistic like Hitler. But as the war went on, World War II went on, and the Luftwaffe
lost its prominence and power.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The worse the Luftwaffe did over the war, the less influence he had with Hitler. And by the end, Hitler's ordering, at the end of the war, Hitler's ordering his murder, essentially.
The one thing about Goering I always thought was valuable, and you touched upon it, is he was good in those parties where Hitler was horrible.
Yeah.
Hitler had very little social skill. Goring that was his skill. So if Hitler was a great orator, Goring is a great party goer, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and that's valuable.
Best parties in the Third Reich.
And I think those things are valuable in coalescing their power initially.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's Herman Goring. How about Heinrich Himmler? You mentioned him briefly with the SS. How about 30 seconds on Himmler?
Again, somebody who came from a good Catholic German family, was little too young to have fought in World War I. Always sort of resented the fact that he didn't get a chance to do that. Got a degree in a technical college, became a chicken farmer, failed. And I don't know if it was the fact that he was a farmer, but he eventually came to believe in the social Darwinist species or superior, and he bought that, became a Nazi in the early 1920s, eventually gets into the SS, and eventually takes over the SS in 1929, and an extremely ambitious individual, and uses that to build the SS up into this really massive organization. Not only is the SS become extremely large, the fighting SS, the Waffen-SS in World War II, many divisions. They also run the concentration camp system. Huge economic empire they have, using concentration camp labor, sometimes sending them out to businesses who pay them for the slave labor. So he creates this huge organization. It's very important in Nazi Germany to carry out some of the things that Hitler wanted to do.
And we mentioned this individual already, Reinhard Heydrich. He's basically Himmler's number two, but he's so ruthless that he's the instrument from which he uses the SS as an instrument to push forward the Nazi agenda.
Yeah, particularly when it came to the Holocaust here. He was the one.
Is he the final solution? I know that you were really discussing the rise of the Nazis, and we're not even really going to be able to talk about the war or the final solution. If you wouldn't mind, would you come back sometime and discuss, because
love to.
That's an important topic as well, not just the rise of the Nazis, but the aftermath of that as well. But how about Reinhard Heydrich? Like, where does his influence with the SS, and how does that affect, like you said, did he come up with the final solution?
No, I would not say he came up with the final solution. I think the final solution, as I think historians believe now, sort of evolved over time and circumstance, given the sort of basic fundamental views that Hitler had about the Jews. Circumstances on the ground, opportunities, Hitler's views, they all sort of came together. Sometimes it's called cumulative radicalization. Hans Mommsen talks about the Holocaust coming about sort of that way. But Heydrich was very important in that process because he was always looking to carry out what Hitler wanted. And he's the one that is holding the Bonsai Conference. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And the Bonsai Conference, which is held in January of 1942, is not a conference whether we should do the final solution. It's really a conference on how to carry it out. So all parts of Nazi Germany were there. All the Foreign Office and the Army and all the different organizations and ministries in Nazi Germany are there to sit down. How do we gather the Jews? What are we going to do with them? How do we get rid of them? So it's to organize the process of collecting them from where they are, different parts of Europe, transporting by train, get them to certain locations, and then doing away with them. In other words, the death camps.
How about Martin Bormann?
Bormann was the sort of quintessent Nazi bureaucrat. He understood how to function in bureaucracies, and particularly after Hess flies out to Britain in 1941, he's the one that sort of takes over the functioning of the Nazi Party itself. And that's a sort of fulcrum for power, to control the Nazi Party, who gets appointed in different positions, and then they owe him authority. He could get stuff done for Hitler in terms of what the party wanted, Remember, the party and the state are the same by this time. And so that's sort of his avenue of power, is the control or gain control of the bureaucratic apparatus of the Nazi Party. And he was willing to sit with Hitler and listen to Hitler's rants for hours. He even wrote a lot of them down. You can find, the transcripts of those conversations.
And I think Borman was also the person who made sure that the Berghof was constructed. That became almost a second seat of power for Hitler. Mm-hmm. And since he controlled the Berghof, he controlled almost like a chief of staff. He was the gatekeeper, and that increased his power exponentially. Yeah.
As Hess was the deputy Führer, Bormann sort of becomes the equivalent of the deputy Führer. We talk about in American presidency, the chief of staff sort of controls what the president sees, who comes in to see the president, things like that. And that's sort of the role that Bormann played, particularly when it got into World War II.
And then finally, you mentioned Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. He really has that position just because when Nazi ideology and so forth was in its infancy, he was there by Hitler. But you mentioned how he flies out of Nazi Germany during the war. We didn't really get into the war, but what happened with that, just briefly?
Hess decided in 1941, with Britain still not invaded and defeated. Hitler didn't do the invasion after the fall of France. The Operation Sea Lion there was at least a theoretical attempt to invade Britain, but Hitler never bothered, didn't do it. And so Britain's still in a war. Hitler's on the verge of invading the Soviet Union. And Hess thought that somehow he could fly to Britain. And he had there were some British aristocracy who were very friendly to the Nazis.
He had a connection because of the Olympics with a Scottish...
Lord Hamilton, I think was his name, or something like that.
And his thought was he was going to fly to Scotland, jump out of land, but when he couldn't land, he jumped out of the plane, never parachuted in his life. He parachutes down. A farmer finds him. He says, "Take me to Lord Hamilton," which none of it really ever transpires. And he eventually gets into prison, and that is a huge political black eye for the Nazis during that time. I think Hess was a little unstable.
Oh, there's no question about it. After the war, he's tried in the Nuremberg trials. He doesn't get the death sentence, probably because he was out of the war pretty early. Wasn't involved much in the Holocaust era, so that's probably what saved him. But he spent the rest of his life in prison, and he was judged by the American psychologist who interviewed him as mentally unstable. I mean, they were even considering not putting up him on trial at the Nuremberg because he was so unstable. The other Nazis thought he was unstable as well in the trial.
I think that's what Hitler used as an explanation, that he, even at that time, before he left, they viewed him as a little unstable. I think he was involved in the occult and all kinds of weird things, trying to move things with his mind. Just an interesting character. And it's unfortunate that we're kind of running out of time and we're not going to be able to get into the war itself. But if we go back to that first question, if we can end on that, why did this happen? And I know it's going to be, that could take you an hour just answering that question. But if you could just give a few key points, how is it possible that in a cultured, educated, industrial society like Germany, that somebody like Hitler can rise and National Socialism can rise to power?
Well, I think it takes the right circumstances. It takes a Germany that was broken after World War I. It takes a Germany that had gone through the Depression and created all this chaos. And it takes the right sort of person at the right time to manipulate, somebody who's out to manipulate this situation. I think all those things had to sort of happen at the right time with the right people for this to come about. Sort of a short version.
And I just find it interesting. I think that the answer to that question is such an important historical question because we want to make sure that something that horrible never happens again, because those impulses don't go away. Mm-hmm. In history, we're all just human. There's nothing really that much different besides our knowledge and so forth of the current time. But as a human being, we're not that much different than the 40s or the 1840s or 44 BC. And so we have to guard against those impulses because they could happen again.
Yeah, I don't think human nature has fundamentally changed over the last 10,000 years. And I always think that one of the most important things that history can tell us is that we should never think that things are completely unique. That, in other words, that this could never happen again because, well, we're a better country, we're a different country. You know, these things can happen. And if you look around the world today, you can see we have the rise of these sort of illiberal, demagogic, populist leaders popping up all over the place here. And so it's something that if you believe in democracy, you know, you have to think about how do I defend it every day. Just as those people in Germany at this time, they had to think about that too. And unfortunately, not enough of them either did or knew how to defend it against somebody as ruthless as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis.
Thank you, Dr. Mauter. This has been a really fascinating conversation. Would you come back again and discuss Germany during World War II? Because there's a lot of important concepts that we never got a chance to discuss, including the final solution and some of the other things, the horrible things. But would you come back some other time and discuss that?
I would absolutely love to. There was two very important topics, and historians are still arguing, debating, and finding new information about those topics even to today. So I'd love to come back.
I'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Wendell Mauter. Such a fascinating insight into German politics, the rise of Adolf Hitler. If you would like to try our featured beer from Hofbrau München, Hefeweizen, that beer we tried today, it's available at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, which is available on iTunes, Spotify, nearly everywhere where music is purchased online. Remember to subscribe and leave a comment for a chance to win a gift card. Join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.